Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this this webinar we've got today from the Business Growth Hub in partnership with Optima and with Calum Lewis. A very timely one today, navigating the supply chain in a perfect storm. There's actually a previous one on our website, on our YouTube channel that Calum's done, which is still up there, which kind of sits well in tandem with this one. So if you're going through this one, which is being recorded, and then you want to go back and watch the previous one, we'll send out the link to that. Just a word about the Business Growth Hub before we kick on. Obviously, you know all about us, but do stay in touch. You know, we have a host of one-to-one support. We run a host of cohort programs, both virtually and now more and more doing them in person as well, which is nice. I'm Nick Brantwood from the manufacturing team. Many manufacturers there, you may know me, and that's my bit done. I was just kind of doing the introduction. Enjoy the session with Calum, and I'm going to hand over to Calum now.
Thanks a lot, Nick, and welcome to our webinar today. As Nick said, my name's Calum Lewis, and I'm the founder and principal consultant at Optima. Our agenda today is going to focus on how operational activities and indeed performance of operational activities determine financial results and shape return on investment. We'll be looking at how the design and management of the supply chain influences key aspects like revenue growth, costs, working capital, and assets. In uncertain times, and we certainly face that at the moment, there are things beyond our control, clearly. But also there are things within our control, and perhaps to some extent, when we're looking at the supply chain, there are areas that haven't been a focus before or haven't been addressed or given due attention previously. As we go through, we'll be asking what concerns you around your business at the moment, so there'll be a short audience poll around that. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end once we've gone through the core concepts. Just a bit of background really to Optima and to myself. My background is very much in supply chain management across all areas really, from sourcing, manufacturing and logistics in a range of different sectors, including most recently, just before forming Optima a couple of years back, I was with Lego for 15 years. And really Optima's approach and the sort of diagnostics and methodologies we use I sort of derived from quite a bit of my time with Lego and indeed working with some Lego colleagues to develop this methodology, because we really look at, we really take a sort of a design thinking approach to supply chain management and looking at how we can balance service, cost and capital to create, as we say, supply chain excellence by design. It's really our belief that all businesses can be set up for supply chain success and develop the capabilities to achieve excellence. It's not really just the preserve of large corporates. We also believe that fundamentally creating an environment where supply chain excellence is inevitable is as much about people as it is about processes and technology. As we go through today, you might think there's an emphasis on particularly on process, etc., but underpinning all this is our people, and we'll talk about that towards the end as well. I guess when we look at supply chains, where effectively supply chains are network systems with feedback loops. They're not simple linear chains of activity. So changes or disruptions or developments in one area can influence and affect other parts of that sort of system. I mean, we've seen clearly over the last couple of years the effects of the COVID pandemic. And even at the moment, because of, for example, in China, their approach to COVID, we're seeing impacts in terms of factories and ports being restricted in their operation. I guess maybe many businesses, particularly if they're exporting into the European Union, have been impacted by the sort of administrative activities that are now required to make that happen. And also clearly, unfortunately, very much in the situation at the moment, the terrible situation in Ukraine, that has clearly the potential to impact. Yes, we all know about things like the oil and gas exports from those areas and some of the commodities that come particularly from Ukraine in terms of wheat, sunflower oil, neon gas and various other things. But Shipping, which has been a lot in the news over the last year or two and how it's affected supply chains, that could be another factor, because they're currently around 15%, I think I saw the other day, of container ship crews come from either Russia or Ukraine. So there is quite a few things that in the last couple of years have prompted questions about supply chain management, and indeed its design and structure. The format we're going to go through shortly, I believe, is pretty important. I think it's very important to take a structured approach to looking at how the supply chain works, looking at operational activities and how that translates into financial outcomes. The approach we'll talk through, I believe, can give some clear insights and perhaps challenge current thinking and current ways of working. So without sort of further ado, I'll start off with the approach we want to run through. And this is very much taking a systematic view around how different operational decisions, different operational ways of working across the supply chain drive financial outcomes. With that sort of clear insight, we can start to see how operational decision making will impact revenue, impact costs, capital employed, etc. By taking such a view, and we'll be going through each of the dimensions you sort of see on the sort of left and right hand side in some detail in a few minutes. That allows trade-offs to be identified and therefore to be managed, and can sort of help us in terms of looking at how to build a sort of sustainable financial position based on the operational designs and decisions we make. This is Optima's approach. This is our health check approach, and it's allowed us to work with a number of clients to look at return on investment and how operations are driving both profit and determining capital employed. It can help to avoid surprises and can also support decision making when things change. So when perhaps one dimension changes or there's a disruption in one place or another, it allows us to see how that might impact overall. So in a few minutes, I'll talk through each of the sort of circles on the left and right hand side to give you some ideas about what might be appropriate for your business. But before we do, I've got a quick question for you all. So at the moment, clearly, there's a lot of things going on. So I just wondered at this stage, what is the biggest concern for your business right now? There's some options there, and it'd be good to just to get a bit of an insight into what's sort of shaping your thinking right now. Okay, thanks very much. So a bit of a spread there: material costs, labour costs, and potential shortages, and also what's happening post-Brexit and some of how those trade flows have been affected. Okay, thank you very much. I guess when we're looking at supply chains, supply chains are really geared to clearly geared to satisfy demand. So our real first question when we're looking at how operations impact financial outcomes is to look at the service. And crucially, are we meeting customers' expectations? Sometimes it's not easy to track exactly how a supply chain might deliver revenue or growth. And there is some quite a bit of research around this in recent years. A figure I saw recently was from McKinsey, who did analysis looking at how supply chain is affecting service and revenue. And it indicated for a range of businesses, those that were achieving good supply chain service or excellent supply chain service were typically gaining around 3% gross revenue lead over average performers. So well, it's not always easy to translate from good service, delivering product on time, to growth and profitability, there are a number of surveys out there that indicate quite significant gains from getting service right. But I guess that is more, from my point of view, when we're looking at service, it's really important to understand how the supply chain is serving customers from the customer's perspective. Internal measures are useful, be that on time in full and all the usual sort of internal type measures. But it's really important to get a view on what the customer is experiencing and thinking. That is to say that we might not necessarily be underserving customers. There can be instances where, in a sense, customers are being overserved. Some work we did with a client a year or so back, that particular client was under a lot of pressure to reduce lead times, some sort of a 3-day lead time to a 2-day lead time. But when you actually looked at the customer, they were feeding into retail. Now, in that retail base, they're typical, we're holding 4 to 6 weeks of stock of that particular customer's product. So whether it was 2 days or 3 days, you'd have to argue the context of that when the actual further down the chain, i.e. in retail, we're holding 4 to 6 weeks stock. So looking beyond the obvious and looking through the chain was important to understanding how pressure to serve, well, what did that actually translate to? And so I think overall, it's pretty fundamental to understand what are the customer's expectations, what are their requirements, how do they stack up in a supply chain sense, as well as complementing the existing in-house measures, if you like, of things like on time in full and order fulfillment, etc. Which really leads me on to a key aspect in terms of using supply chains to drive growth, and that is what is the nature of the customer relationship. On this little schematic, if you like, there's a sort of a low collaboration tends to infer a more traditional supply chain. Most likely in most businesses, there's something like an 80-20 rule. So there'll be a group of customers that are the most important or most valuable customers to the business. Then in that sort of context, it then becomes a question of how developed are those key relationships? Building those sort of collaborative relationships with key customers has been demonstrated in a number of instances to yield significant benefit, both in terms of looking at where costs develop across the chain and perhaps taking those out, but also improving service and maintaining better availability to the end consumer or end user. That's not to say every business will end up with a fully synchronized supply chain with vendor managed inventory and highly collaborative planning, but working together with customers and looking at how the supply chain operates can be a significant source of growth and revenue that allows relationships to be built, and for customers. Indeed, it helps when those customers might think twice about switching suppliers when they've got an established, reliable, trustworthy supply chain developed with a particular supplier. And that's sort of really the key point for me around collaboration is also that it's about relationships, about mindset rather than just technology. There's a lot of ability around now to capture data and share it. But really what's going to make this really tick is the mindset approach, the mindset used. I mentioned I was with Lego for 15 years. I did a lot of work with retailers across Europe and developing collaboration with them, be that planning events or promotions, etc., or indeed managing the retail inventory for them. And so, quite a number of instances at the outset of launching those relationships, it was about challenging cultural perspectives and existing ways of working. What I really took from that overall, however, is those retailers that we worked with that were most open to collaborative relationships. We built success in terms of key obvious measures like availability on shelf, etc., and we grew sales. Those retailers that were not interested, and we struggled and took a long time for us to build collaborative relationships with ultimately struggled. And there's one very well-known toy retailer who did not wish to engage, and they no longer exist. So I think building collaborative relationships is a key area for how the supply chain can make a difference, driving sales revenue and driving growth, as well as when you're working mutually with customers, finding ways of reducing cost and, for example, making inventory more efficient. So in two areas really of supporting revenue growth, one is making sure the service is particularly well tailored to the customer base that you're working with, and then seeking to look at how you can build relationships and explore the potential that's offered by collaboration. Moving to the cost side, starting with product costs, there are a number of ways of reducing product costs, and probably you may well be working on a lot of these already. That said, in terms of materials and labour, there are usually a number of opportunities, and some of those will lie within the scope of operations teams. But often the most significant opportunities stem from taking a more broader or cross-functional approach. Often this can start at the design stage, really, when we can apply concepts which things like design for manufacturing, things like design for logistics are well established and offer plenty of opportunity. Also at the design stage, we can look at what components or materials we're using. Can we create through our design common components that go into a number of different end products? That helps to reduce cost, to reduce working capital. So really what I'm saying around product costs is it really starts at the design stage, challenging ourselves to see how we can work with designers, work with them to sort of understand how what they're designing and choosing translates into supply chain. And also planning, how do we go about planning the supply chain, can have a pretty significant effect on labour, for example, in terms of how we're scheduling production, etc. So whilst what I'm trying to, I guess, taking a more of a end-to-end perspective and looking across core functions, design, planning, etc., can help us to look at where opportunities might be to manage product costs. So it's not just within the remit of, say, operations or manufacturing, for example, or perhaps logistics. It can be broader than that. So I think taking that sort of end-to-end perspective with some design thinking is pivotal to managing some product costs. That said, product is by no means the only supply chain related cost. This is a sort of fairly simple score model, supply chain operating model. But really what I think that's important to emphasize is some so-called indirect costs or supply chain costs can be significant, particularly when we look at the range of activities that are required to manage a supply chain. What level of resources are required or to be devoted to such planning and management and administrative tasks, and what is driving some of those resource requirements. Typically here we're looking at process efficiencies or effectiveness. So what is causing consumption of resource, say for example around demand planning, supply chain planning, etc. Are we doing a lot of progress chasing? Are we doing a lot of expediting, firefighting, etc., which clearly drives up resource consumption when you're having to plan and replan and etc., etc. That would suggest information flows aren't what they should be. It could even suggest that there's quite a lot of silo working across those different activities in the supply chain. So really having looked at product costs, which usually are more tangible straight away, looking at supply chain management costs is equally important, and trying to understand what resources are used, how those resources are deployed to different activities, Typically using something like activity-based costing can be hugely beneficial to giving real insights into so-called indirect costs and highlighting opportunities. In our experience, simply looking at these sorts of costs highlights opportunity. We'll look at working capital efficiency, because clearly in any business really, cash flow is critical. So understanding how the supply chain is impacting on the cash to cash cycle is an important aspect to look at. We'll touch on inventory in a few minutes, a bit more depth or looking at inventory. But equally, accounts receivable, accounts payable are significant factors in terms of how we manage operations. Getting paid by customers, accounts receivable. If we've got issues, for example, with deliveries, that can give rise to claims, payment delays, etc. That can have a not insignificant effect on cash-to-cash cycle. So we talked about service earlier on, but equally, that can, if that is not going well, that can impact clearly our cash flow. Just to highlight in a way that things are clearly joined up when we start to look at some of this. Supplier payment terms should be a factor in our decision-making around sourcing of product and feature in any kind of trade-off evaluation we're making between what a product might cost or components might cost, or and what the extent of working capital we need to devote to that supply line. So maintaining keeping a view on cash-to-cash cycle and on trends, particularly in some of the underlying operational aspects that might drive some of these outcomes, is a good way to try and focus on maximizing working capital efficiency. And specifically inventory. Really, I guess in a fairly straightforward sense, we have two dimensions of inventory. We clearly have safety stock and cycle stock. Safety stock is really a function, should be there to manage the balance between sort of demand variability and supply variability. So if our forecasting is good, bad, or indifferent, that is going to translate into a level of safety stock. If our suppliers are reliable or unreliable, that is likely to translate into some safety stock. If you're using any kind of inventory management system, they're typically factors that will be used to drive the safety stock calculation. So anything we can do to improve forecast accuracy, planning accuracy, anything we do to work with suppliers to ensure reliability can help us reduce some of that safety stock, and hence the working capital that's associated with it. Cycle stock, i.e. the stock we go through or going to use to satisfy demand over the lead time, is clearly related to that replenishment lead time. So if we're looking at supply and looking at where to source product, lead time is should be an important factor in thinking about that sourcing decision. And making, I mean, you could argue it's a fairly classic trade-off between what bought-in cost you can achieve against what lead time and capital you have to deploy to that. So understanding cycle stock, understanding the role that lead time plays in it is an important factor in making those sourcing decisions, and could be an area that's worth exploring. In essence, really, inventory management is very much a process that's reliant on cross-functional activities and processes. So, for example, we mentioned forecasting. So who is responsible for forecasting in the business? What role do sales and marketing play in that? What role do any inventory or supply chain people play in that? So understanding that we're working from the same hymn sheet and have aligned KPIs is pretty important for managing our working capital and inventory. If we weren't manufacturing or if we're in logistics or running any of these sort of things, we're likely to have some fixed assets in the business. And utilization of our assets and asset efficiency, looking at that, if there are process issues elsewhere in the supply chain, those can often act as drags or effects on utilization of our assets. I mentioned forecasting accuracy a couple of minutes ago. If we're subject to frequent changeovers to try and expedite production, for example, because our accuracy of forecasting is not where it perhaps should be, that's going to drive up some of our changeover time. So changeover times of themselves may not be down to purely the operational efficiency of changing from one product to another for example, on the shop floor, can often be driven by having to change too frequently because we're not planning well enough. So when we're looking at things like asset utilization, etc., again, it's about looking outside of the immediate aspect and thinking about in the system. We're doing a bit of system thinking and looking outside of it. What factors are pushing in to make those changeovers? If we're running with capacity buffers in our assets, you could argue we could be duplicating. If we've got inventory and we're also using capacity as a buffer, you would have to potentially look at, are we effectively doubling what we're doing in terms of the sort of capital we're trying to apply to some kind of buffer against uncertainty. And some of that uncertainty, is that true uncertainty, or is it simply an information flow aspect? For example, are we holding capacity buffers in manufacturing or in logistics because we get sudden demand surges or spikes? Are those demand surges or spikes potentially planned? So are they, for example, a promotion that has been run but has not been communicated through the different functions through the business? So when we're looking at capacity, we need to understand what's consuming it and whether that is a buffer, whether that is causing us to need buffers in capacity, as well to whether there are process issues elsewhere in the supply chain. So really, we've taken a quick walk around the different areas that influence profit and capital employed and ultimately return on investment. I think it's really important that when we're in a situation of uncertainty and when we're trying to work our way through, for example, the last 2 years or indeed the coming time, if we've got a good understanding of how the operational factors are driving outcomes. So, for example, if we've looked at service, we understand what we're doing or not doing on a service in terms of trying to support revenue. We've looked perhaps at some of our indirect costs and how we're managing the supply chain. If we can bring those all together into a coherent overview, like something like this, it can really help us make decisions. It can give us insights, it can give us ideas, it can give us opportunities to improve. And once we've got this picture together, we can use that for ongoing monitoring of performance. And if different things happen, it can allow us to make judgments about how to adjust. I mentioned sourcing a few times as we've walked through this. So we might be able to get product costs down by sourcing in a particular location that might cause us to drive up inventory because it takes longer to get that product to us or those components to us. Vice versa, equally, it might cost us a bit more to do sourcing perhaps more locally. The classic scenario is sourcing more locally might drive up the initial product cost, but that could reduce inventory and the costs associated with inventory. So not just the capital employed, but the storage facilities required, etc., the handling, etc., required. So creating a view like this, I think, is important to really get under the skin of how the decisions are affecting outcomes. So if we really understand how the supply chain is working under these sorts of dimensions, it can really help us to make proactive and positive decisions, even in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty. Taking such a view may prompt a fair few questions around processes, etc. how they're working today, how could they work in the future. It may prompt questions about the overall operating model. Do we need to work in, do we have facilities in different geographical locations to make supply chain work more effectively? And indeed, at the moment, you could argue technology can do some of the heavy lifting in making our processes more efficient. But I mentioned at the outset, one of our beliefs at Optima really is that in addition to processes, technology, etc., people are the foundation for supply chain excellence. And really underpinning a sort of a dashboard or an overview like this or a health check like this is to really underpin that with understanding the skill sets that are in the business, understanding what capabilities would allow the business to operate more effectively on these dimensions that we highlight here is critical. And also looking at in KPIs, incentives, how the organizational is geared in that sense is another key aspect, so that we make sure that KPIs, incentives, bonuses, etc., are coherent with what we're trying to do in supply chain sense. So the whole area of people management, skills, capabilities, motivation is critical to delivering the sorts of outcomes we might want to achieve once we've got these sorts of insights. Well, hopefully that's given you some ideas or thoughts to consider in how you're approaching your supply chain. We would, as I say, strongly recommend taking such a systematic approach as we've sort of outlined on here to ensure that those trade-offs are identified and managed and decisions are made with the best insight possible, and take that forward and use such an overview to make decisions going forward. So at that point, I said we'd have some good time for questions. So it'd be good to know if there's any sort of questions out there about any of the aspects we've just run through. Either drop that into the chat or let's just open up for questions.
Calum, you've given quite a few models there, just in terms of developing supply chain strategy, and one of those being sort of the planning inventory matrix, and there was also some good stuff in there just on terms of stock holding. I'm just conscious of the fact that any review that took place sort of 2 years ago, given what's happened in the world, would be out of date now. What would your recommendations be in terms of how often people should conduct a supply chain strategy review, and then what should the triggers then be for them to revisit it?
I guess when we're looking at if I just sort of wind back a second, if I just went back, sorry. Oops, there we are. Just to wind back something like this sort of model. For me, this isn't a sort of a do it once and switch it off for a few years. Really, a lot of the information coming into this overview is, coming in all the time. It could be coming in, well, I don't know, you could argue that for perhaps monthly, perhaps if you're looking at management accounts coming through and giving some of the costing information. Some of the inventory could be reported however frequently. Other things are happening every day. But if we maintain a sort of a view like this, it's consolidating this on a regular basis. So be that monthly or whatever is relevant for a business. But if we start to see things going awry or start to be challenged by certain things on here, that should prompt those questions. I don't see supply chains as really being static in the sense that you do it once and you set it for the next 5-10 years necessarily. Clearly major decisions about we're going to have a new factory here and we're going to build it and we're going to put X number of production lines in. Yes, that is a significant strategic decision. But once that's sort of in play and you've sort of deployed those assets, how you utilize them, how they're being, what efficiencies they have, etc., that feeds into here. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question. I think for me, achieving supply chain excellence is about having a constant view like this sort of thing, so that you can keep up to speed with what's happening. if you're starting to see disruptions on supply lines and you're building inventory to buffer that, that should be coming out on here. And it might be something that's okay for a period of time, but then you might want to address that and find a new operating model to try and address it. So in essence, I would recommend a sort of an overview like this, a sort of a dashboard like this is regularly maintained. And that might prompt a number of different actions. If you're looking at another sort of a major strategic review in terms of adding a lot of capacity because you want to grow in certain markets or grow in certain areas, that's fair enough to do a reasonable separate exercise, you could argue. But having done that, feeding information about the reconfigured operation into this would be fundamental.
Oh, that's clear. Thank you. Just a follow on from that, from what you said, and just an article I read sort of during lockdown. There was an article written on just in time, and it was quite a provocative article, just saying that its days numbered as it had its days. What are your views on that? Because obviously it was done for competitive advantage, and over the last 2 years it's been anything but. Are the days of just in time numbered?
I'm going to cop out and say it depends.
That's fair enough. That's fair enough.
I guess if you're looking at ultimately with just in time, it depends where. I mean, stock is held somewhere in a supply chain, so it might be just in time from point A to point B, but somewhere back in the supply chain there is somebody sitting on inventory. You could make an argument in some instances, in some industries, just in time has been used as a mechanism of shoving inventory back up the chain. So it's sat somewhere. It just happens to be sat somewhere a long way away, which doesn't help if disruptions happen. So I think that keeping inventories tight, managing them effectively has always been important, and it still is. Given the summer disruptions we've seen, it might prompt a rethink about to the extent that a business might run just in time, or it might run particularly lean. It might seek to have some degree of inventory buffer, which it didn't previously have. It might look at where it's sourcing that product from. And again, those sort of trade-off type decisions are important to be made, and using a structure like this could help.
Yeah, and I think there's still competitive advantage in being slightly more just in time than your competitors.
Yes, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're able to keep your working capital reasonably tight, you can obviously utilize. Well, you're freed up. You don't have that capital tied up in inventory, for example. So you may decide to deploy that elsewhere or not deploy it, but it will give you a potential return, better return on investment, which is really what shareholders are looking for.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So if there are no really further questions from that, well, I thank you for joining today. If you would like to discuss any further aspect really of this with myself or one of our team from Optima, please do get in touch. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.